car crashes, defective products, dangerous drugs, injuries, and abuse. Across the state of Alabama, the attorneys, proudly sponsored by the law firm of Hollis, Wright, are here to serve you. Your tough legal questions answered by our experts with the attorneys of Hollis, Wright.
Hello, I'm Art Franklin, your host for The Attorneys. So glad that you are joining us for this very special show. We're talking about civil remedies for victims of crime. We've got a very special guest joining us. Freddy Rubio will be talking about that in just a second. But first, I want to remind you that Hollis Wright has attorneys standing by live right now to take your calls, to answer whatever questions that you may have. That call is free. It is confidential. All you have to do is dial 1-844 Law Talk, and you can reach someone right now. Let's get over to Josh now and our special guest, Freddy Rubio, talking about civil remedies for victims of crime.
So, you know, this is an interesting topic because a lot of times what we see when we're doing shows is we're just dealing with civil related issues. What we're going to be talking about here is not just civil issues, but remedies that arise out of criminal conduct. And, you know, so it's a good example of the interplay between the criminal code and civil law and how those two things overlap. There's no one better on this topic than Freddy Rubio. Freddy's a longtime friend of mine. He is well known in this area. He's got an incredible practice and does really, really good work. And so, number one, I'm super happy to have you on. Good to see you as always. Talk a little bit about how this topic was created, because this is not a topic I think we've ever done before. Of the some 600 shows we've done, tell me how this topic kind of came into creation.
First, thank you for having me on the
Absolutely.
show, Josh. I really enjoy being with you, and to all your listeners and viewers. You know, we handle a lot of civil cases, a lot of personal injury cases, but we often have victims of crimes that call our office and they want to sue the perpetrator, the person that caused them the harm, that caused the crime. And so we spend a lot of time explaining reasons why we should or should not file a lawsuit, or whether we should let off the pedal in a criminal prosecution so that we can recover civilly against normally an insurance company.
And, you know, Art, one of the things I know we'll talk about today is really two issues. One is Alabama is a unique state in that we have what's called joint and several liability. That's kind of a complicated legal term. The general point is, though, that we don't apportion damages in civil court. So if you have a criminal defendant and you have another defendant, like let's say a hotel, and those two parties are involved, you can collect a gigantic verdict against the criminal defendant for the wrongful conduct, and then you can go collect it against the hotel. It's called joint and several liability, where the jury determines and assesses liability and a number, and then they allow the court to figure out how that's paid down the road. So joint and several liability plays in a lot to this because it gives civil lawyers a hammer, if you will, to be able to convince maybe less culpable parties, but that have responsibility for an event to resolve their claim. The second thing also is the interplay with insurance companies on how to plead these cases, because if you don't plead them correctly, you can plead yourself out of insurance coverage where there may not be insurance coverage at all.
That's why it's so important to have attorneys who really understand that, because it sounds very complicated. And something else you mentioned, Josh, was how the two mesh, how civil and criminal mesh. Can you explain how those two come together, Rubio?
Right. So normally what we see is somebody that is a victim of a crime, and they're focused on prosecuting the perpetrator. And then later on, they realize they have either medical bills or lost income or property damage, and they want to file a lawsuit. And sometimes we get those phone calls months down the road after they have called the police, after they have given a statement, after they have given a recorded interview. And what happens is that that sets in stone the initial statement. And then if we file a lawsuit against a third party, whether it's a hotel, someone that may have coverage for that loss, then the insurance company normally uses that statement as saying, hey, that was a criminal act, and our insurance policy excludes criminal acts. And that's the interplay. So we got to be careful. We got to think ahead and call a civil lawyer before we get too far down the road of a criminal prosecution. The other way that criminal and civil interplay is that if there's a criminal prosecution and there's a parallel lawsuit going on, normally the civil lawsuit gets stayed, gets stopped while the criminal prosecution ends or gets litigated. And that's, of course, because of the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. We cannot take the deposition or the statement of a criminal defendant while he still have charges against him.
One of the things that we have found, and I know Freddie's seen this too, is there are judges that allow you to be creative, even though there may be parallel civil and criminal cases. And yes, the criminal defendant has a Fifth Amendment privilege during their prosecution for the criminal side. There are things that you can gather, documents you can gather if you are a victim with a lawyer that don't impact that Fifth Amendment right. Like, for example, we see it in the context of dram shop litigation, which is alcohol-related cases where you have a drunk driver and then you have a bar. You can still go get bar receipts. You can still go get credit card receipts for the defendant as long as they don't have to swear under oath and testify under oath. So this is a shining example, and it's the point Freddie really was driving at, which is be careful going to give a statement and getting too deep in this without getting a lawyer on your team. You want a lawyer on your side to be able to help lead, guide, and direct you through the process.
And really, if the client's goal is justice and the client wants to really prosecute the perpetrator, let's take the example of a dram shop, of somebody that came out of a bar intoxicated and hurt a loved one. You may still want to call a civil lawyer immediately so that the civil lawyer can send a letter of preservation and make sure that a video is saved by the bar, that the receipts are saved. And that may help against a criminal prosecution if that's your main goal.
That's a great point. Just preserving evidence is critically important. Talk with me for a minute about, you talked about intentional criminal conduct. A lot of times that's not going to be covered by insurance. Are there ways around that, though, where even though there may have been intentional criminal conduct, there are ways that you can still activate coverage?
Absolutely. But let's talk about the general rule first. The general rule is that you cannot make somebody liable, civilly liable, for the criminal acts of a third party. And let's give the example. If I go into a store and one of the secretaries or an office slaps me across the face, I normally cannot sue the owner of that store, that establishment, if that was truly a criminal act, because the store owner didn't have knowledge that that secretary, that clerk was going to commit a criminal act. Now, however, if that person has done that repeatedly in the past, then the owner knew or should have known that a criminal act was likely to occur, and that is when we can trigger civil liability, and that's what we call in legal terms foreseeability.
Yeah. We're going to unwrap some more of those when we come back, because there are ways around certain types of criminal acts where there's still civil responsibility, not only for the individual that engaged in the criminal conduct, but also for the entity they work for, they operated a vehicle for, those types of things.
Yeah, we're going to give Freddy Rubio a little bit of a break right here as we take a break. Also reminding you that you can follow Hollis Wright on all of the social media channels, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, right now, and also get in contact with any of the lawyers at the firm at 1-844-LAW-TALK. We'll take a break, a lot more to unpack when we come back. Stay with us.
I'm Josh Wright with the law firm of Hollis Wright, a personal injury law firm, and thank you for watching The Attorneys. We hope you, a friend, or a loved one never needs legal counsel for a case. But if you do, the goal of the show is simple: to provide answers and legal counsel when you need it the most. Your call to the show is free and off air. So if you have questions specific to the show or related to other accident or injury topics, call, email, or text us. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, or go to hollis-wright.com and click on the Contact Us button. We know your time is valuable, so thank you for spending it with us and watching The Attorneys.
The Attorneys, proudly sponsored by the law firm of Hollis Wright, are here to serve you.
When we started the show 8 years ago, my hope was we would be able to do what we do best, which is to help people answer real-world legal-related issues they have in their life.
People oftentimes are confronting various legal issues and problems in their lives that range across the gamut of legal practice areas: bankruptcy, criminal law, family law, just to name a few. And to be able to have a 30-minute platform or format to where we can just cover various legal topics once a week, that's obviously the primary focus of the show.
That we would be able to use the resources of the many lawyers we have at this law firm to create a plan that had a lasting impact that also gave back to the community at the same time. And I think we've done just that with The Attorneys.
And we want to welcome you back to The Attorneys as we have a special guest, Freddy Rubio, who's joining us, and a lot to unpack here. In fact, we've got a number of questions too we want to get to as well, because we love getting those questions from viewers from the show, because a lot of you at home, as you watch, you are forming questions. I want to remind you, you can call 1-844-LAW-TALK and reach an attorney with Hollis Wright right now. But if I could, Josh, I want to jump into one of these questions that we have. This one's dealing with Freddy on restitution and coverage. Somebody broke into my car garage and stole a bunch of personal belongings. The person was later caught. First part of this question, can I sue the perpetrator? Second part, what if they don't have money? How can I get paid to replace my stuff?
Right, very important and happens all the time. The analysis when somebody comes to our office, can I sue the perpetrator, is sure we can sue and sure we can win. The bigger question is, can we recover anything from the perpetrator? And you know, if we have a career criminal, the likelihood is not. So why go down that path? Now, if we want to recover for our losses, property damage, in Alabama, we have what is called, in a criminal case, restitution. And that is court-ordered payment for the damage caused by the criminal. And normally, the judge can impose that restitution to be a contingency, to be a requirement before the case is closed. So there would be a restitution hearing where the victim gets to prove his or her damages. And that includes lost income, medical bills, or property damage. And that way you can guarantee that that perpetrator pays for all the damage he or she committed before the case is closed.
And it's court ordered too, so the court monitors those payments to ensure that they are actually paid, and if they don't, in theory, that person can actually go to jail. So it's not like a debtor's court where we talk about bankruptcies and repayment where no one's ever going to jail. It is an individual who has been told and has agreed to some restitution program, and if they don't pay that, they're in theory in violation of either their parole or their criminal conviction, and they could actually go to jail. This happens more than you would think it would. Let me give you a shining example of a case that I'm aware of, and that is a family that we represented a while ago where a wife had just completely redecorated her living room and spent a bunch of time, effort, and money on it, and a driver who was being careless and was intoxicated left the road and ended up in their living room in the middle of the night. It didn't cause any personal injury, thankfully, but caused a tremendous amount of property damage. Well, you would think, well, the guy has car insurance. He didn't have car insurance. Restitution ultimately is what helped that family. They, of course, had some homeowners help too, that we kind of led, guided, and directed them through. But restitution was a big component of how that ultimately got reimbursed.
And that's over time.
That is over time.
So it's not right away on lump sum.
It can be,
Or if they
but
haven't.
generally it's over time.
Right. Based on the ability to pay by the perpetrator, it may be a lump sum.
Okay.
Talk a little bit about assaults. We see circumstances where, for example, a child is a freshman in college, still under the parent's homeowner's coverage, and he gets into an altercation at a university and hurts somebody, and they want to sue that individual and also want to get to your homeowner's coverage. That can be complicated at times.
It can be complicated, and that's why you really need the help of a civil lawyer before you go out giving out statements. Because in a pleading, if you were to read one of those lawsuits, it would say person X negligently broke somebody's nose.
Yeah.
And you wonder, well, why are they not talking about intentional acts? And the reason is because most insurance policies, homeowner policies, will exclude criminal acts and intentional acts. So there's a way of coverage, but it's going to be very fact intensive, and it's going to require the creativity of a good lawyer.
And it's a very narrow window that one would walk through in that hypothetical. But if you think about it, most altercations don't begin by someone saying, I'm going to intentionally go cause this person harm. They start by putting yourself in the wrong place at the wrong time, or engaging in conduct that is not intentional but yet is negligent or is below the appropriate standard of care. So if you plead those cases correctly, that the person put himself in the wrong spot at the wrong time, as opposed to they intentionally went to go harm that person, sometimes there will be coverages. But as Freddie mentioned, and I'd mentioned too, these are very narrow windows. It's why you got to have a lawyer on your side one way or the other. And you know, I know one of the issues that you and I have talked about off air is fraud. Fraud comes in a lot on behalf of corporations and companies where you have individuals that may have engaged in fraud. They're being prosecuted criminally, yet the company can be responsible. I know we're getting ready to go to break, but that's something I want to unwrap when we come back, because a lot of times you will see fraud from someone who stole money, for example, at a corporation, and can the corporation be on the hook for that? We'll talk about that when we come back.
Fraud when we come back, as we continue to talk to Freddy Rubio. Want to remind you that you can get in contact with an attorney at Hollis Wright at 1-844-LAW-TALK. It is a free call. It is confidential. No one has to know that you made that phone call, but you can get your questions answered. We're going to take a break, and we'll be back with the attorneys right after this.
I'm Josh Wright with the law firm of Hollis Wright. In court, attorneys are not allowed to tell juries certain things. For example, we cannot talk about a defendant's net worth, meaning the defendant's ability, resources, or insurance to pay a verdict. In this week's Legal 4-in-1, we're answering the question, why can't lawyers talk about a defendant's net worth to a jury? Now, Rule 403 of the Alabama Rules of Evidence states, in part, relevant evidence may be excluded if its probative value is substantially outweighed by the danger of unfair prejudice. Long-standing Alabama cases have held that the net worth of a defendant falls under this catch-all rule and is to be excluded. The reasoning behind the rule is that if a jury knows a defendant is wealthy, then the jury might award more money to the plaintiff. And this goes one step further. If an attorney makes any remarks that suggest the defendant is responsible because he is wealthy or rich and the plaintiff is poor, that can be grounds for a new trial. If you're ever on a jury, the reality in our state is this. In almost every lawsuit that goes to trial, the attorneys representing both the plaintiff and the defendant have already looked at whether there's sufficient insurance coverage or assets to satisfy a verdict. Most likely, the parties would not pursue a civil lawsuit if damages could not be paid after a jury returns a verdict. So even though lawyers cannot mention the net worth of a defendant during trial, there likely are resources available to pay a verdict in full. Please remember, your call, email, or text to the attorneys is free. All of us at Hollis Wright want to help answer your questions on real issues you face. And remember, a competent lawyer will respond to every question you send in. That's our pledge and promise to you. And as always, thanks for watching The Attorneys.
Welcome back to The Attorneys. Our special guest, Freddy Rubio. As we were going to break, Josh mentioned about fraud is something that we wanted to tackle in this next segment, and that's a big area to cover.
It is. Let's talk a little bit about circumstances where an employee, whether it's through theft or deception, may have engaged in fraudulent conduct, where the entity that they work for could also be responsible and on the hook for the conduct of its employee.
Right, it's what we call when we charge a company with negligent hiring, negligent supervision, negligent training. And what we're saying is that separate and apart from the negligent and the theft and the criminal act of the individual, the company knew or should have known that this person was likely to commit this fraud, and they neglected in supervising or training that individual. And it was their own negligence that caused the loss of our client.
And this is a great example of how you can have joint and several liability, like we talked about earlier, where the jury is going to want to take that individual that engaged in fraud and theft or stole money or deception. They're going to want to take them to the moon in a verdict. And along for the ride can be the company who is responsible in their own right that allowed that person to engage in that conduct, where the coverage may not be the person that committed fraud, but the company and the corporation. And so the individual itself needs to go hire a lawyer to make sure that they're protecting themselves and make sure they're activating appropriate coverages.
Absolutely. I want to get to another question because we really like to hear from our viewers at home. This question is, I was a victim of a shooting by a career criminal. I helped in the prosecution and now the person is in prison. How can I get help paying my medical bills when the perpetrator can't pay me? I think that's a pretty good one. Yeah.
Right, so the Alabama legislature created the Alabama Crime Victims Compensation Commission. And they have a fund that is in part created from fines at the sentencing of every individual that gets sentenced, pleads guilty or is found guilty of a crime. They normally are fined $50, $100 per person. Every county, and they have this fund that if we are victims of a crime, we can apply to it. There are some requirements. The crime has to be reported within 72 hours. The victim has to help in the prosecution of the perpetrator. The claim to the fund has to be done within 1 year. And there's other requirements, but the website is very clear, and there's money available for victims of crimes through the fund.
Talk a little bit about, this comes up a lot with the interplay between the criminal side and the civil side, dram shop or alcohol-related litigation where alcohol contributed to an event. What are some things that you see where there's an interplay between the two?
Right, keep in mind that normally a dram shop is a claim that we bring against the establishment for getting somebody drunk or for serving somebody under 21. And while the individual that caused the injury is usually the drunk and they may have limited funds or insurance, we can always go against the establishment for participating in that negligent act of getting us injured.
Yeah, and so a lot of times we'll see circumstances where someone gets into a barroom brawl and uses a knife or a gun or a bottle and causes serious injury. You'd be amazed at the number of cases that we see where someone dies because of the conduct of someone who's intoxicated, and the question becomes, that is intentional criminal conduct. Are there ways that the bar can be responsible for over-serving that individual? And we could do an entire show on this topic alone. The reality is you want to have a lawyer lead, guide, and direct you through that process, because it's super complicated to hold a bar responsible for intentional criminal conduct unless you can fit through certain windows of the evidence that you have to prove. And so, I'll reserve some of that for a later show, but the reality is you want to make sure you have a lawyer on your side.
But in fact, the question that I have for you is kind of along those lines. The question says, I was injured in the commission of a crime. Can I make a claim against my auto or home insurance, Freddie?
Well, many of our policies of insurance, whether it's auto or homeowners, have MedPay, medical payments through no fault. It's a contractual relationship between the insured and the insurance company, and those funds are generally available if you incur medical bills.
One thing I didn't do at the beginning of today is ask about a little bit about your practice. Tell us a little bit about your practice, because you got a super diverse practice. I've known you for a long time. I've always been impressed with your practice itself. Tell us a little bit about what you guys do.
Rubio Law Firm has a general practice focusing mostly on personal injury, auto accidents, and business litigation. Now, I personally handle some criminal cases and some other areas. We have marketed to the Hispanic community historically, but we're in Homewood. We have 5 lawyers working, and we enjoy what we do.
Individuals in the Hispanic community, do they have the same rights to our courtroom as individuals? For example, if they're not citizens, do they have the same rights as someone else?
Absolutely. Immigrants, Latinos, Hispanics, they have access to the court the same way that every other person has, and there should be no fear in coming and calling a lawyer.
I wanted you to mention that because I wanted that to come out of your mouth, because I think that's important, Art, that the courts are open to everyone. And that's one of the beauties of why I love law, is the court is objective. You see Lady Justice with the blind. The reality is the courts are open to all individuals, those that are here in our state, and so take advantage of that for sure.
Freddy Rubio,
thank you for being on. You did a great job today.
Thank you.
Yeah, you made something complicated sound very simple.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we want to thank you again for joining us each week for the attorneys, and also joining us on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram as well. Still have time to reach an attorney at 1-844-LAW-TALK. You can reach someone at Hollis, Wright right now. They'll take your call. It's free. It's confidential. Thanks for joining us. I'm Mark Franklin. I'll see you back here next week for the attorneys.
Thanks for watching The Attorneys, sponsored by Hollis Wright.